So let's understand the concept of non-real numbers. The square root of a negative number is called a non-real or imaginary number. So here are some examples of non-real numbers. It is negative the square root of -1 or the square root of negative. These are just examples of non-real numbers. So you can see that any root with a negative value is then non-real. And to understand the notation then, the internationally accepted notation for the square root of -1 is the letter I. We say that I is equal to the square root of -1. So this defines the whole set that we are going to work with, the I that we've spoken about previously. So if we have square both sides of the equality, we get that I squared is then equal to -1. So let's verify that any multiple of 4 is equal to 1. So how do I do that? So it's I to the power of any multiple of 4. So I can say it's I to the power of 4n, where n is any integer. Because now I can rewrite the 4n as I squared to the power of 2n, right? Now I've seen that from my definition that I squared is equal to -1. And again, I can break up the 2n into 2 to the power of n. And -1 squared is 1. So it becomes 1 to the power of n, which we know is 1. So let's look at a few examples. Determine the value of the following. So in A, we have I to the power of 3, which I can write as I squared times I. Now I know that I squared is -1 times I, so that ends up to be -I. Then for the next one, where I is to the power of 4, now we've seen that any multiple of 4 is 1. So for C, it is I to the power of 7, which I can break up in I to the power of 4 times I to the power of 3. Right, in the previous two answers, we saw that I to the power of 4 is 1, and I cubed is equal to -I. So that ends up to be -I. In D, it is I to the power of 64, where we know already that 64 is 4 times 16. So without any further calculation, we can say that that will be equal to 1. And for E, it's I to the power of 1999, which in its own turn, I can break up into I to the power of 3 times I to the power of 1996, right? I cubed is -I, and 1996 is a multiple of 4, so that will be equal to 1. So my final answer here is -I. For the last one, I to the power of 2009, in this case, I can break it up into I times I to the power of 2008. So the I stays as it is, and the I to the power of 2008 is again a multiple of 4. So that will become 1. And my final answer there is I. In this next example, it states that it asks to rewrite the following non-real numbers in I form. Alright, so how do we do that? In A, we have the square root of -9, which I can rewrite as -1 times 9, the square root of that. And because it's multiplication, I can give them each their own square root. So now I have the square root of 9, which is 3. And from my notation, the square root of -1 is I. So let's look at the next one. The square root of -20, I can rewrite as -1 times 5 times 4. Right? The reason I break it up like this is because I know that 4 has a square root. So, in other words, it's the square root of -1 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 4, which all then simplifies to the 2 times square root 5 I. And there it is now in I form.